despite you slaughtering thousands or tens of thousands of people,
you can become a good person just by skydiving.
It can't solve the real problem and the real root of suffering, is it? Which is in ourselves.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Wisdom in Exile Radio. First of all, we just want to thank everyone who watched the first couple of episodes, and especially everyone who commented on the YouTube channel. We're really pleased to see people engaging. Today we're going to be talking about the next part of the book, which starts off with the developments from those early Protestant Reformation days. Can you give us a bit of a description about what is millenarianism?
Yes, and last week we spoke about the rise of Protestantism in Calvin and Luther, and how that in a way really rebelled against the Catholic Church and this sort of very clear spelled out version of the interpretation of the Bible. And then with this sort of unleashing of different views and takes on what the Bible really means, one of the quite powerful and dominant factions that came out of that was called Millenarianism. Well, we'll see, it resonates a lot with some of the views which are still very dominant today, but essentially it came from the last section of the New Testament in terms of the book of Revelation, where it stated that at the right time there'll be some sort of cataclysmic change in society, and there'll be under the rule of the Messiah, of the second coming of Christ, there'll be a period of 1,000 years of, in a way, sort of paradise on earth, a heaven on earth, where all the corruption and injustices and evils, as well as bad things in the world, will come to an end, and we'll live in some sort of utopia for 1,000 years, and it'll be ruled by Christ and those who are his followers, those dedicated and devoted to him, and those people that support it will be in some way rewarded in this new paradise on earth. There was a period in the 16th century where their views became quite dominant, still at the time of Luther and Calvin. And essentially what they wanted to do was, as it says, I think it was almost a level society. So whereas in the past, society was very hierarchical, so you had the monarchy and the levels of monarchy and princes and knights and different layers of society, with the peasants at the bottom, and a lot of injustice and so on under this sort of Catholic and monarchical society. Really, they wanted to level that and create this, recognition of equality in some way, you might say, and to create this new society. And some were pacifists, others were more revolutionary and thought violence, could be justified in order to support the creation of this new society.
How did that work out?
Well, you tell me. I mean, we're living the dream, aren't we?
You're being really harsh on millenarians, I think.
Did you know that the Bible precisely predicts events surrounding the end of the world? But most importantly, the Bible gives instruction on how we can be ready for that end.
They were getting closer and closer to the millennium. So they started taking things into their own hands, and they said, well, look, just in case, Christ isn't, going to bring about this, he wants to bring about the second coming. So let's just work towards that.
There's a few elements, isn't there, of Christianity, which holds this promise out to people, and that promise hasn't been fulfilled, certainly not the last 500 years since that movement, which is this original idea of original sin, where things were perfect at some point and then we screwed up and now things are imperfect and bad. But then this promise that somehow through the blessings of God and his son Jesus Christ, that things are progressing towards some sort of resolution where everything will suddenly be perfect and everything will be good. And in a way they really, whereas the Catholic Church said the book of Revelation wasn't to be interpreted so literally, Calvinism and Lutheranism, people actually interpreted and said, this is for real, this is really what it's about, and there will be this thing coming, there will be this perfect heaven on earth.
It became more secular.
Promise, isn't it? Which then they, to your point, I guess they interpreted, well, we believe in that, we're followers of that, let's make that support and make that happen or allow it to happen. But it's this theme, isn't it, of a linear progression of history, which is very different from the Buddhist world. But I think it's one of the reasons for the space in Buddhism is that, you know, it holds up this promise in a way which, from a Buddhist perspective, you know, first noble truth is the nature of existence is suffering. But here we've got this ideology that promises everyone, no, don't worry, you will have heaven on earth, all your suffering will be ended and everything will be good. And it's just a matter of progress, and we're progressing towards this inevitable ideal, this utopia.
It's the focus on utopian and scientific traditions and radical democratic movements. Socialism, Marxism, Nazism, and Zionism all can be seen as secular millennial movements that we're working towards some kind of utopian ideal. Like, how has that made the space for Buddhism?
The space for Buddhism is specifically the decline of Christianity and its degeneration into these worldly philosophies. And you know, this is a good example of a gradual degeneration from quite a transcendental idea of liberation and salvation, the coming of the kingdom of God, degenerated into actually just a worldly kingdom. Although, of course, that's also, as you say, it's in ancient religions as well, especially early Christianity and so on. But it's an externalization of the idea of ultimate happiness in the world.
Yeah, what's wrong with that, though? I mean, I know what's wrong with it, but like, it bears unpacking, right? Like, because a lot of people might be listening to this and they're like, "That sounds awesome. Let's shoot for that."
Yeah, that's right. I mean, certainly when I was young, I believed in it 100%. You know, yeah, because it reduces, isn't it? Like, you've lost over time anyway, you lose the sense of transcendence, isn't it? There's more to life than just this world and the material world and your material wealth and the economy and how many goods you have and external signs of happiness, as it were. And you're externalizing the such happiness that you can get it in these material outcomes. Because like with the original Millenarians, this leveling of society, you know, it's your point, it's externalizing. It's no longer about the internal and one's spiritual happiness in your future rebirth in heaven or hell. Suddenly it's about looking for external signs in this world, and it becomes more and more, and over time to today, as it's become more and more about this life and your material circumstance is really the promise of happiness.
Yeah, it says in a little bit later on in the book, it says the utopia hasn't put in an appearance, and it's not going to, because without an internal transformation, there can't be any truly lasting external transformation. And that's the problem with all these movements, is that they completely disregard any interior transformation, which in Buddhism we would express as we're totally under the influence of these defilements or disturbing emotions, you know, hatred, desire, and ignorance. We're completely driven by those forces. It doesn't matter how much you reorder the external world, you'll still be driven by those forces. And that's, of course, exactly what we see in the modern world. No matter how many promises are made with the technology and so on, or future or politics, people in charge seem to be completely driven by, you know, selfishness, ignorance, and all kinds of petty prejudices and vanities.
Was there a degree of eternalism in the millenarianism movement? Because wasn't it also something about that, you know, we're not just going to enjoy this period of sublime happiness, but it's going to last forever, right? It's going to be like unending.
One of the funny things about, I think that's right. One of the funny things though is like, at least they had a reason for thinking utopia was going to show up, which is like, you know, Jesus is going to come back. It's going to be amazing. You know, we're all going to be part of this great thing. But nowadays, what exactly is the reason for progress? What are all these supposed signs of how much we're progressing? Is it like quick delivery on my Amazon orders? You know, is it the great state of politics? What is it that makes people so convinced that things are progressing towards this utopia?
I don't think most people like are too concerned about their Amazon deliveries.
But yeah, move forward a few hundred years to the French Revolution, things have shifted. Certainly in that sense about the God bit, it's changed quite radically. Yeah, but do you want to sort of summarize the French Revolution and what that looked like?
All right, I'll try.
People don't know this, but Norin is actually French. He's actually...
Yeah, I was French briefly for a short period of time, just to clarify, so no one is like, no comments on YouTube about this. For a brief period of time, it said I was like 20% or 28% French in my Ancestry.com profile.
Only 20%? Sure about that?
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah, I heard a different number. But...
yeah. And then it shifted, and I got an update, and it said, no, you're not French at all. You're mostly Spanish, English, Scottish, and a little bit of Portuguese, and there's no French at all. After I'd embraced, the French New Wave and Truffaut and all, yeah. And then it was like, too late. You've already identified with being French, and now you're not French. So I was exposed for the hypocrite that I am.
But sorry, yeah, do explain to us
all right. The French Revolution. Convergence of lots of different things. So at the time leading up to the French Revolution, it was a feudal monarchy. So there was King Louis XVII was the monarch at the time, and he had spent a lot of money investing from the French economy in the American Revolution, because the American Revolution was against the British, the English, who was France's common enemy. So he had come close to bankrupting the French economy by investing in the American Revolution. And so France was in a time of poverty, and that was really manifest if you were one of the peasants of the working class. So they were the only group that were taxed. So there were essentially three groups in France at the time. There was the aristocracy, the clergy, and the commoners. And though the common classes were taxed, and they were the ones essentially trying to repay the debts for all of these foreign wars and investments that the aristocracy had deemed like, this is a good idea. So there was some unhappiness, and that coincided with the fact that a lot of people had learned to read and were figuring things out kind of for themselves. We don't have to be ruled by why do we have to be ruled by the clergy and the aristocracy? We can figure some of this stuff out for themselves. Schooling had been made kind of universal. I think it was mandatory for children to be in school up until the age of 14 in France at that time. So, most people were relatively literate at that point, which surprised me. And so there was an increase in knowledge and education, and this discontent about poverty, and it reached this kind of climax, this breaking point. And so King Louis said, all right, let's convene the meeting of the three estates, and the three estates being clergy, aristocracy, and the commoners, and we'll come up with some kind of agreement. And the problem there became that 98% of the population were represented by the commoners, and just 2% were represented by the clergy and aristocracy. So it became an issue of representation. This was kind of embodied in the Jacobin movement, which was a political movement which had some nobles who were partly buying into this idea of equality for all, but also partly just trying to appease the rising tide of unrest and unhappiness.
To the chopping their heads.
Yeah, so there was a revolt, obviously. Basically, the people who started the impetus behind the revolution were ultimately, a lot of them ended up being executed, like Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre, who was behind, he had signed the death warrants of hundreds, if not thousands, of death warrants of people going to the guillotine. And he ended up being guillotined himself by a group within the revolutionary movement that were a little bit more moderate. They're like, look, we're okay. We've done enough killing now. Let's try and restore some order and calm. And he was like, no, there's still more to be done. And so they cut off his head. But this was widespread. There was a lady called Olympe de Gouges, and she was a radical feminist of the time, and they ended up cutting her head off because she was against capital punishment. And it ended up with thousands of people being guillotined. By the way, if you're British, you pronounce guillotine with the L, guillotine. And if you're American, you say it like the French, guillotine.
That reminds me, we weren't saying Renaissance wrong last week. We were saying it like English people say it, but Americans say it Renaissance, which is a bit more like the French.
Why is that? Oh, because it's like the French.
Same thing.
Which doesn't it that reflect the French influence over American culture?
Yeah. French Revolution, was that your summary?
Space? Yeah, I guess like the space for Buddhism from the French Revolution was largely contributed to the de-Christianization movement that came out of it. I mean, it went from there being like the number of clergy was drastically cut, churches were desecrated, and priests were killed, nuns were killed. It was pretty barbaric and radical, and the French Revolution was at the time seen as a de-Christianizing movement, and replacing it with reason. They went into churches and they're like, this is now a temple of reason.
Yeah, I saw that, the cult of reason.
The cult of reason.
And even they even had a festival of reason.
Right, along with changing the calendar to the decimal version, because that was more in terms with science, which had like 10 months. They actually had that calendar for 12 years, which is somewhat insane.
One of the most interesting characteristics of the French Revolution is it was its bloodthirstiness. It was definitely. I'm sure there were atrocities in the German peasants' revolt on both sides, and there were all the previous kind of revolutions. But the French Revolution seems to have taken it to a sort of new level where actually the bloodthirstiness became its main characteristic. It was like feeding on itself, to literally to the point where they were executing their own. Robespierre's the classic.
One of the other things about the French Revolution, isn't it? It's the first successful one. It was actually successful.
Yeah.
But it was a bloodbath, and like I said, they turned against their own. But it was successful, and what I found interesting as well, reading about it, was how even despite all that sickening bloodthirstiness and slaughter, you read about it today. It's still but it was a success. They overthrew feudalism, which is one of the first acts they passed. They got rid of the monarchy almost entirely.
Briefly,
shot their heads off, and they achieved, in some sense, a state of they achieved the goals, the ideals of liberty and equality, and so on. And so one of the things about it is like they seem to have replaced the ideal, isn't it, from this heaven on earth. The Jacobins completely rejected Christianity. In fact, one of the outcomes of the revolution was to explicitly try to destroy and remove any Christianity in France and destroy the church. And yet the patterning is very similar. They've got an ideal, which is a utopian ideal, very similar to the millenarians. And the thing that I thought really comes through strong, isn't it? Is that whole idea that the ends justifies the means, and that somehow if you're on the side of righteousness, despite you slaughtering thousands or tens of thousands of people, if it's a righteous cause and you're perceived to succeed in some way, then well done, good job. But at the end of the day, this is the thing, isn't it? The promise of these utopian ideals, really, what did you get at the end of it? Was it really so wonderful?
They got what they wanted. There was a point where could have been like, okay, let's just back off, right? We've abolished the monarchy, we've abolished feudalism, done, write that into the Constitution, now let's stop. But then they proceeded with this awful, orgy of blood. And opportunism as well. There was a lot of people that rose through the ranks of power, not least of which was Napoleon, who became a general by the age of 24, and then shortly after that announced himself emperor, which to me is like another form of monarchy. And so what did they really achieve? And then shortly after Napoleon's rule, they reinstated the Bourbon family, which was the King Louis again.
Yeah, and Napoleon supported the Catholicism.
He's not only supported Catholicism, but he also supported the reinstatement of slavery.
One thing as well I want to point out about one of the echoes today of the French Revolution that I think is really dominant in our culture is it was going back to this idea of Buddhism requiring an interior transformation and saying that there won't be any true happiness in the world unless you work on the interior world. of the mind and the defilements. Whereas the French Revolution and subsequent revolutions, and now especially in the West and in modernity, it's all about, not only is it about an external utopia, but there's this idea that you can become a good person just by having the right thoughts and joining the right group of people. And there's this division in society now, American society, between the left and the right wing. And the only difference between them is the political ideology that they ascribe to. There's absolutely no working on being a kinder person. You actually become a kinder person by joining the right group and assenting to the right opinions and reading the right websites. You don't actually have to be kind or practice kindness or have a kind mind or a compassionate mind.
I'm playing devil's advocate here, but some of the professors that I had been in classes with were present. They would say it's kindness to pursue things like social justice, which is a political movement, and that in itself then muddies everything, because like you're saying that there isn't an internal change that's being required, but
yeah,
as clear cut as that.
But then of course it just leads to these contradictions. Like you get these absolute sadists practicing kindness by killing and absolutely being soaked in blood.
That's a radical extreme. But you see the danger of, that's a spectrum that we're on, right? I mean, it's not like there's a clear cutoff. Like, oh no, you can have these political views and then it stops here, because we see it all the time. Like leading up to the French Revolution, there was years of rioting and civil unrest. What are we in now? I mean, it's the same thing, but where does it cut off and become, okay, now we can go out and kill people in the name of like our ideals of equality and fraternity and liberty?
Yeah, but that's the thing. If you look at history, isn't it? It happens again and again.
It does, yeah.
Well, I think as Albert Camus says, the welfare of the people is the alibi of the tyrant. It's always the same. It's always for the good of man. Whether it's, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Third Reich. Exactly. It's always...
It harkens back to the letter, actually, that Lama recently sent out. It was yesterday. That he said, samsara is still samsara, and it doesn't offer any real solutions.
It's easy, isn't it, to ascribe to an idea, but there's no personal sacrifice and no, so you elevate yourself to the state of the righteous and the good because I believe this, left or right, this is the right thing and it's good for people, but you don't have to do anything. And that's the thing, right? Lama Jampa often talks a little about things have to start with the personal, not some big conceptual idea about what's good and bad, about some vague notion of humanity. It always starts with the personal. I mean, it's jumping ahead, but I think it's the last chapter of the book on love and compassion, where, it's the whole way you do nearly everything in Buddhism. You always start with the personal and then expand. You don't start with some vague concepts of good, and which we've seen again and again can justify almost any atrocity and barbaric behavior.
Yeah. Well, one of the other interesting characteristics I wanted to mention about French Revolution was going back to the cult of reason and the new religion of reason. One of the leaders of that wanted to, or did actually have above graveyards, when you go into the graveyard, I think it was, they would have above the gateway, death is an eternal sleep, which of course is a very modern, it's supposed to be a modern idea, but definitely goes back to the French Revolution. French Revolution definitely also has these seeds of materialism. That of course now materialism is an unofficial religion of the modern world, but they were, not only did they want to annihilate God, although later they got a bit more into deism, which is like the ultimately inaccessible, distant God. But they definitely had introduced this idea that death is a freedom from suffering, which is the essence of this idea. Death is an eternal sleep, and that's what most materialists, which most people these days, think that death is an eternal sleep, freedom from suffering. But of course, in Buddhism, we don't think it's quite so easy. You don't get away from your suffering just. I
was going to say, was it viewed as a bad thing or a good thing? Like, because
it was part of this "we're not superstitious" delusion. We've got over the old superstitions. The ideal good is actually just being a good citizen, and not, you know, and loving reason and liberty and fraternity and all this stuff.
But there's also, you often hear, isn't it, this notion that if you don't believe in God and death is it and it's all over, man, you're being brave somehow.
Yeah.
You know, you need these myths to make you secure. But there's a complete opposite. It's basically another Christian idea just transmorphed into this thing, you know, eternal bliss, you die. Great, you go to eternal heaven. Only the thing is about the materialist heaven, which is complete freedom from suffering because you just die, is that you don't have the hell bit. So, you know, that's the thing. So every Christian, at least you got to worry about, shit, I might go to hell. With the materialist thing, it's like, well, whatever, Gov, at the end of it, I'm just going to be fine.
I know. And as you say, they actually think they're being brave. So somehow it's brave to believe in this eternal freedom from suffering that everyone automatically gets on their death. I mean, it's a joke, and it's a complete inversion of or rejection of the teaching of the Buddha, which is that if you want to be free from suffering, you really have to work at it. It doesn't happen automatically at all.
Isn't there at least some redeeming qualities in thinking about impermanence, at least from a materialistic perspective? And I'm just playing devil's advocate. I'm trying to think, well, maybe they have a sense of urgency, because you often hear people like, you only live once, you know, like, yeah. So you might as well do something important, right? And
as much good shit.
Well, that's a hedonistic approach, but I don't know. I don't know if all materialists are. And again, I'm just being devil's advocate. I mean, who knows? They could be. I mean, and I think, to be honest, to some point we're like pigeonholing people, and because like we all still buy into materialist things, whether we call ourselves Buddhists or not. Like, and we joke about laughing about, you know, worrying about our Amazon deliveries or not, but we're all part of this society. You know, it's not like we've stepped outside it. So it's important not to ostracize them in that way, I think. And I think in some ways you can think about death and impermanence and it not just be this like, now I've got to really go skydiving, or now I've really got to go buy that Porsche, and, you know, this is it. Because some people just like, you know, it's really about now, and so I should do good. However they get there, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a religious part.
Yeah, true, but the notion of good, if it's not grounded in something, just mutates all of the time. And then, as we've already said, like, the notion of good can strangely become, you know, this bloodbath.
Well, I think to Paul's point though, isn't it? It's like, I personally think that an example of that is the family, isn't it? Having a family, looking after family, having to like put yourself out day after day to look after the kids and leave something for them and help them through life. That is something so grounding, which transcends religion or background, or because again it comes down to the personal, isn't it?
Or critical theory generally wants to destroy the family. So again, and what do they think that's good? So again, the notion of good has to be grounded in something transcendental, like, you know, the teachings of the Buddha. Otherwise, it will just be twisted and distorted till you actually end up destroying the family.
No, I hear you. I'm just saying that I think there are some materialists out there, and I'm purely being devil's advocate, that are family people that perhaps are secular, that say, I want a better world, a material world for my great-grandchildren. You know, I'm going to be dead, but I do want the future to be somewhat more comfortable and easier or pleasant for my descendants. So there is something beyond this life, and there is a degree of contemplating impermanence there. So I hear what you're saying about, like, you know,
but I would argue that a lot of those beliefs, you know, like enshrined in, you know, the United Nations Bill on Human Rights and so on, most of these beliefs are leftovers from Christianity, morality, really. And only they got rid of the God bit to justify it.
But so is critical theories. These are all as we're showing, these are all descendants of things like the French Revolution, which itself was a descendant of the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, and so on. There's a stream through all of these things. Christianity contained within itself the seeds for its own destruction, and that is what creates the space for Buddhism. Because as it's you know, just sort of dissolved, and science and politics have tried but failed to fill the void to a satisfactory degree, We need something else, and that something else is Buddhism.
Yeah, because Christianity never had the answers. But then the destruction of Christianity is just the destruction of Christianity. It didn't have any answers either. And this comes back to that last point, isn't it? It's always searching for happiness in the external. Was it the Lama says, chasing after the forgetfulness of pleasure in the world as sort of some sort of substitute, but it can't solve the real problem and the real root of suffering, isn't it? Which is in ourselves, our own disturbing emotions.
You said to me earlier this week, though, about how, at least with some forms of Christianity, they had a moral compass. So I'm not arguing that like Christianity was like, doesn't have the answers that Buddhism does, but perhaps it at least provided a moral compass for people.
I never agreed with that. The problem, this so-called moral compass that's been provided by Christianity, well, the poles keep shifting. Because if you look at most Protestant churches nowadays, they're just following the latest secular morality, which of course is always changing, especially in the last few years. So they don't provide a moral compass. Actually, nowadays they follow the dominant secular morality.
That's true, but there is a root of morality there, more in the Old Testament, isn't it? Like the Ten Commandments. I mean, if people did that, that'd be a good start. But nowadays, you can interpret it in different ways,
Well, I think we've probably criticised Norin's countrymen in the French Revolution enough. I think, no need to belabor the point. Any final thoughts on from millenarianism to the French Revolution?
Well, not really, but I think, maybe next week it would be good to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment Thinkers. Because there was also this intellectual debate going on, and Voltaire and Rousseau and Hume and so on, which sort of justifying why Christianity is debunked from the view of reason. And I think that really weakened the whole basis for Christianity as well. And that was in the background. So maybe we could touch on that.
So good, interesting, lively discussion. I hope you all agree, and we're looking forward to being enlightened next week with the Enlightenment. I'm sure that's when things got great. So we may not need Buddhism after all. We'll see next time.
Post your comments, and then we'll try and respond to them.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks everyone, and Norin and Paul. See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.